Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the weirdest pregnancy tests in medieval history. And yes, some of them are weirder than your last online date. Before we dive in, hit like if you enjoy weird history, subscribe if you want more, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe put on something you don't mind getting a little gross. You wake up in a chilly stone room, straw sticking to your ankles, the midwife humming, while the iron tang of a latrine hangs in the air, and a clay pot of urine sits like a sacrament on the table. They don't swish a stick in a lab, they plant your pea in barley and wheat. They wedge garlic where the sun don't shine. They sniff and taste and call it science. Sometimes you get a sprout. Sometimes you get a curse. It's equal parts desperate hope and accidental botany. And honestly, would you trust your future to a sprouted grain? Stick around. I'll walk you through the ones that surprisingly worked, the ones that didn't, and which tests we definitely should not bring back. Tell me which you dare try and why. The market square of Eldoria thrummed like a drumbeat. Stalls spilling spices, rotted cheese, and the clamor of haggling barons. Lanterns flickered orange, casting buttery shadows on cobblestones slick with rain. In the marble hall of the palace, Lady Isolde glided past tapestries depicting dragons and courtly love, her sapphire gown whispering against the stone. Courtiers craned their necks, eyes flickering like moths, for the kingdom's future hinged on the royal bloodline, and her beauty had become a political weapon. Whispers curled through the corridors like smoke. Isolde might be carrying a child, and the king's heir was a ticking clock. The royal physician, a gaunt man with spectacles stacked like tiny towers, barked a summons to the court's most eccentric scholars, promising gold and a place in the annals of history. They arrived clutching dusty tomes, jars of herbs that smelled of rot and rosemary, and a grin that hinted at mischief. The air grew heavy with incense, and the sour tang of fermented goat's milk as the scholars prepared their tests, a phrase that sounded more like a medieval meme than science. First up was Brother Hob, a monk who swore that a candle's wax would melt differently on a pregnant belly, like watching a butter sculpture melt under a dragon's breath. Next, Lady Marable, a herbalist who claimed the scent of a woman's breath could be read by a trained ferret. Yes, a ferret, sniffing like a nosy gossip columnist from the 21st century reality shows. The most baffling was Sir Cedric, who suggested tying a rooster's feather to the lady's wrist and watching whether it sang a lullaby. The crowd snorted, half in disbelief, half in amusement. Their concoctions filled the hall with a cocktail of burnt sugar, earthy pine, and the faint metallic scent of dried blood, making even the stone walls feel uneasy. The king's steward paced, his boots clacking like a metronome on the cold floor, muttering about succession like a twitchy streamer worrying about subscriber counts. Meanwhile, Isolde stood stoic, feeling the weight of the room like a sack of wheat on her shoulders, her cheeks flushed from the candle heat and the absurdity of the spectacle. The scholars argued, their voices rising and falling like a lute in a tavern brawl, each claiming their method was as foolproof as a dragon's promise to keep its treasure safe. The irony was thick, a kingdom on the brink of war, relying on ferret-sniffed breath and rooster feathers. A comedy of errors fit for a Shakespearean farce. When the final test was set, an elaborate rite involving a ceremonial bowl of river mud, a silver spoon, and a chant that sounded oddly like "May the Force be with you." The court collectively held its breath, half in anticipation, half in disbelief. The mud slipped slick across Isolde's palm, cold as a morgue slab, while the crowd murmured prayers and jokes in equal measure. This bizarre ballet of superstition, politics, and slapstick humor marked the start of a courtly quest, a journey that would weave through dark dungeons of intrigue and bright halls of triumph. As the lanterns flickered out, the kingdom leaned into the absurd, ready to chase whatever omen the mad scholars conjured. In the dim light of the early morning, the village square swelled with the clatter of hooves and the smell of damp earth. At its heart stood the old stone basin, half filled with cold water that reflected the gray sky like a tarnished mirror. Elder Marwyn, head of the wheat water oracle, lifted a handful of golden grain, his fingers trembling like a nervous jester. He whispered ancient verses, his voice rising above the gossip of market women, promising that the humble wheat would decide a woman's fate. The crowd leaned in, eyes bright with hope and dread, as if waiting for a medieval version of a reality TV reveal. The ritual began with a splash that sounded like a reluctant sigh, sending ripples across the surface and shaking loose the scent of barley and river mud. Marwyn poured the grains into the water, watching them tumble and spin like tiny ships caught in a storm. Women clutched their skirts, inhaling the acrid perfume of cow dung and fresh rain, while the old priestess muttered a prayer that smelled of incense and stale cheese. A hushed hush settled over the crowd, broken only by the occasional cough or the clacking of a nervous horse's hooves. All the while Isolde, the blacksmith's daughter, stared at the floating kernels with a skepticism that could grind stone. When the first grain bobbed up like a lazy duck, a gasp rippled through the onlookers, and the women began to whisper that the wheat had risen, an omen of barrenness. If the grain sank, the water swallowed it with a soft thud, and the crowd erupted in cheers louder than a tavern brawl after a winning hand. Those whose wheat floated were ushered to mutter curses that smelled of bitter herbs, while the sinkers bowed their heads and begged the heavens for fertile children. The priestess threw handfuls of salt into the basin, the grains sputtering like tiny fireworks, and a chorus of prayers rose, some as solemn as a funeral dirge, others as frantic as a Shakespearean lover's soliloquy. Even the village dog barked, perhaps sensing the drama, or just the scent of wet grain, adding a canine soundtrack to the absurdity. Isolde watched the whole spectacle with a raised eyebrow, thinking that the whole thing resembled a medieval version of The Bachelor. Except the rose was a piece of wheat, and the drama involved wombs, not dating. She could feel the tension coil in her chest like a coiled spring, the air thick with sweat, fear, and the faint perfume of pine, resin from the priestess's staff. When a particularly stubborn grain lingered at the surface, refusing to sink, an elderly widow clutched her rosary and swore that the wheat was conspiring with the devil, her voice cracking like a broken lute string. The crowd's murmurs turned into a low roar, and for a heartbeat, the entire village seemed to hover between hope and despair, like a cat balancing on a narrow fence post. Isolde, meanwhile, imagined the future, her own child's fate, now tethered to a grain's buoyancy. A ridiculous notion that made her grin despite the gravity of the moment. When the final grain finally sank with a dull splash, the square erupted like a fireworks display, though the only fireworks were the villagers' shouts and the occasional whoop from a nearby shepherd. Marwen declared the woman fertile, and the crowd swarmed her like bees to a honeycomb, patting her back, spilling cheap ale, and chanting verses that sounded suspiciously like a medieval rap battle. The wheat water oracle, absurd as it was, left a lingering taste of iron and hope in everyone's mouths, a reminder that destiny often rides on the back of the most ridiculous rituals. Isolde slipped away, the mud squelching under her boots, thinking perhaps the real test was not the grain, but the villagers' willingness to cling at any sign of life when the future seemed as barren as a winter field. And so the story of the floating wheat sank into tavern lore, retold with a wink and a grain of salt, much like a modern meme about questionable pregnancy tests on the internet. The royal hall filled with the sweet, earthy perfume of freshly ground wheat, as the court's appointed seer spread a golden mound on the flagstone. He whispered the ancient formula, waiting for the grain to swell or shrink, the age-old pregnancy test that had once foretold kings and kittens alike. Yet this time the wheat bobbed indecisively, neither puffing up like a pregnant belly, nor flattening as if a barren field. The murmurs turned to uneasy chuckles. Whispers slipped through tapestries like moths, and even the palace cook sneered, even the grain is playing hard to get. The king's eyes narrowed, and when the wheat test yielded ambiguous results, the court pivoted to a far stranger oracle. In the shadowed alcove, a sleek tabby named Marga, with eyes like polished amber, lounged atop a silver spoon polished to a mirror shine. The midwife Isolde, fingers trembling, lifted the spoon and tapped it against the cat's whiskers, proclaiming, "If she swats away, the child is hers." Marga flicked the spoon with a lazy swat, the metal clinking like a tiny gong, then rolled onto her back and batted the spoon away, sending it skittering across the marble. The court gasped. A cat's disdain was as clear as a modern nope emoji, and a ripple of uneasy laughter rippled through the onlookers. Yet some whispered that a cat's fickle heart could be coaxed, and the rumor mill started grinding faster than a medieval millstone. For the final verdict, a thick honey-scented candle was lit, its flame sputtering like a nervous child in a dark tunnel. The wax dripped amber tears onto the stone, and the smoke rose, curling left, then right, as if dancing to a silent lute. The court astrologer, beard twitching, declared that smoke drifting toward the east portended a healthy birth, while a westerly curl warned of a miscarriage. The plume twisted toward the cold stone wall, painting ghostly ribbons that smelled of burnt incense and damp wool, and an uneasy hush fell over the assembled nobles. The direction sparked heated arguments, with some insisting the wind from the open window had cheated the omen, turning the candle test into a heated debate hotter than a dragon's breath. As the candle's ghostly tendrils faded, the courtiers swarmed like ants at a spilled honey jar, each eager to spread the latest scandal. Two rival midwives, Mistress Gerda and Sister Brina, seized the moment, hurling accusations that the other's herbs had poisoned the test, their voices rising above the clatter of armor. The palace gossip mill whirred louder than a medieval loom, and even the royal jester snickered. Looks like the cats got more drama than a Netflix binge. Servants whispered in the kitchen that Isolde's reputation hung by a single whisker, while the kitchen fire crackled, adding a smoky backdrop to the intrigue. Between the clinking goblets and the rustle of silks, the atmosphere thickened with tension, as if the very air were pregnant with rumors. Isolde stood at the edge of the fireplace, her hands slick with sweat and the faint scent of rosemary, feeling the weight of a kingdom's gaze settle on her shoulders. She knew that a single misstep could topple years of painstaking trust, turning her from healer to scapegoat faster than a plague spreads through a crowded market. Yet she squared her jaw, pulled a fresh bundle of wheat, and spoke in a voice steadier than a cathedral organ. Let the signs speak, for truth cannot be silenced by gossip. The murmurs softened, and even the skeptical noblewoman with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt, hinted that perhaps the cat's disdain was merely feline moodiness, not divine rebuke. In the end, the court's whispers became a chorus of curiosity rather than condemnation, and Isolde walked away, her reputation bruised but not broken, like a battle-worn horse still ready to ride. The great hall of Castle Ravenshade trembled under the weight of a king's impatience, his brow furrowed like a storm-clouded sky. Word spread like gossip at a market. Isolde, the lady of the court, might carry an heir, but the chroniclers whispered doubts. Desperate for certainty, the monarch summoned his most trusted apothecary, a man whose hands smelled of boiled herbs and old regrets. "We shall not trust riddles or midwives," the king declared, his voice echoing off stone arches. "We shall watch the very blood of the woman herself." The courtiers exchanged glances that said, "Here we go again, another medieval version of a reality show." The apothecary set up a grim tableau, a brass basin of cold water, a sack of fresh goat's blood, and a pot of vinegar that hissed like a dragon's breath. He drew a sharp lancet, its tip glinting in the torchlight, and sliced Isolde's wrist with a flourish that would make a barber surgeon proud. Scarlet streams gushed, coating the linen and dripping onto the stone floor, the scent of iron mingling with the sour tang of acetic acid. He poured the blood into the vinegar, stirring with a wooden spoon that creaked under the pressure, and watched as the mixture began to darken. The court held its breath, as if waiting for the world to spin backwards and reveal the secret in the swirling crimson brew. Murmurs rose like a kettle about to boil. Lady Margit whispered that the potion resembled a medieval Instagram filter crimson sunset. She joked, though none could scroll through it. The alchemist's eyebrows rose in silent challenge, his grin as thin as a lute string, while a jester in the back faked a swooning drama, spilling his own goblet of mead in faux disgust. The mixture's hue shifted from a bright ruby to a murky claret, each change accompanied by a collective gasp that could have frightened a ghost. Candlelight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls, making the stone seem as alive as a dragon's underbelly. Irony dripped from the scene, a test of life forged from the dead's own juices, all for a crown's peace of mind. When the liquid finally settled into a sable black, a hush fell thicker than woolen cloaks. The king's eyes widened, his gauntleted hand trembling as he lifted the bowl, as if it held the answer to a cosmic crossword puzzle. "The queen is barren," the apothecary announced, voice flat as a pewter mug, and the court erupted into a chaos of shouts, clapping, and a few bewildered sighs. The revelation slammed the line of succession like a misplaced plot twist in a binge-watch series. No air, no continuity, just a throne left to wobble. Somewhere in the distance, a minstrel began a mournful ballad, his lute strings weeping the very sound of a kingdom on the brink of a dynastic cliffhanger. In the aftermath, the king retreated to his chambers, his mind replaying the crimson trial like a medieval binge watch of The Crown meets Game of Thrones, only with far less glitter and far more blood. Advisors whispered of marriage alliances, of distant cousins with questionable morals, all while the kitchen staff silently prayed that the next feast wouldn't involve any more vats of viscera. Isolde, cheeks flushed with embarrassment and the faint scent of vinegar, bowed her head, her future now a tangled tapestry of gossip and intrigue. The court, still buzzing, began to draft new laws, perhaps banning blood vinegar experiments in favor of something a bit less aromatic. As the torches sputtered out, the castle settled into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of a future where the only red thing was the king's rose, not his test tubes. When the candles guttered low in the great hall, the murmurs of the court swirled like smoke over the king's banquet. The royal steward, a gaunt man with a nervous twitch, whispered that the sky-born omens had failed to reveal Isolde's secret. Yet amidst the clatter of goblets, a lone scholar clad in patched robes and a crown of ink-stained hair stepped forward, his eyes gleaming like polished amber. He tossed aside the crumbling parchment of prophecy with a flourish, declaring the old charms as hollow as a minstrel's empty lute. The audience leaned in, curiosity humming louder than the lute's last string. The scholar began by exposing the absurdity of the kingdom's favorite pregnancy tests. He recounted how a priest once measured a woman's belly against a sack of wheat, insisting that a swollen loaf meant a child, while the woman swore she'd just eaten a particularly airy soufflé. He demonstrated the rooster feather method, shaking a feather over a suspect's stomach, then shouting "balk," as if the bird could sense hormones. The courtiers winced at the foul smell of goat's milk mixed with herbs, a concoction that made the palace cat sneeze in protest. Laughter erupted when the scholar likened the old rituals to a medieval version of The Bachelor, where roses were replaced by dubious potions and dramatic rose-throwing contests. With a grin, the scholar produced a modest bundle of thyme, sage, and milky white mugwort, its fragrance sweet and earthy, like a forest after rain. He instructed Isolde to steep the herbs in warm water, inhaling the vapor as if it were a spa day for the soul. Then sip the brew while watching the fire's amber flicker. The audience watched the steam rise, carrying hints of pine and pepper, while the sound of the hearth crackled like distant applause. As the brew settled in her belly, a soft, rhythmic gurgle rose, more a satisfied sigh than a mystical omen, the scholar announced, with the certainty of a weather forecast, that the herbal test confirmed the child's presence, and no blood-scented goats or moonlit charms were needed. Relief rippled through the marble corridors like a tide pulling back from the shore. Even the king's clenched jaw unclenched, his eyebrows unfurling into a grin that could melt a frozen moat. Courtiers burst into cheers, clinking cups and slapping backs, while the palace cooks tossed extra loaves of honey-glazed bread into the air, the scent of caramelized butter mingling with the lingering herb aroma. Isolde, flushed with both pride and the lingering warmth of the brew, laughed, a sound that rang clear as a church bell, cutting through the lingering superstitions. The king raised his sword, not in battle, but in a ceremonial toast, declaring reason as the new banner of his reign. The realm settled into a tentative peace, the previous dread replaced by the gentle hum of hopeful anticipation. In the weeks that followed, the scholar's modest test became the talk of taverns, outshining even the most scandalous troubadour tales. Merchants began selling tiny sachets of mugwort, calling them pregnancy pouches, a marketing trick that would make modern influencers jealous. The court's scribes replaced ominous runes with diagrams of herbal leaves, a subtle nod to the age-old battle between myth and method. As the kingdom edged toward a new dawn, the king joked that his next decree would ban any test that required a live rooster, referencing a beloved sitcom where characters always overcomplicate simple tasks. And so, the realm took its first tentative step onto the rational side of history, leaving behind the dark, dusty corners where strange pregnancy tests once lurked. The cobblestones of Lichfield clattered beneath a rain-slicked market, where hawkers shouted over the scent of fried onions and goat milk cheese. Young Thomas, apprentice apothecary, with ink-stained fingers, darted between stalls, his satchel jingling with dried herbs. A shrill bell from St. Bartholomew's infirmary sliced through the din, summoning the town's two healers like a medieval Uber call. Mother Agnes, a wizened woman whose braids smelled of rosemary and old parchment, lumbered out, clutching a wooden spoon like a wand. Together they exchanged a glance that said, "Here we go again, again, again." Inside the stone-capped infirmary, coughing villagers huddled on cracked benches, their breath a chorus of wheezes and desperation. The fever had turned faces a ghastly shade of beetroot, and the air reeked of boiled toadstools and something metallic, fresh blood. The town whispered. The mayor's blacksmith, desperate for a cure, had offered the newborn's first drop of life, a ritual even the local bard called the worst baby milkshake ever. Nurses ladled the murky brew into wooden cups, the steam rising like a ghostly incense that tasted of swamp and irony. Thomas winced as the scent hit his nose, thinking of the time his mother tried to make him drink toad soup after a bad magic show. Thomas swirled the potion under a flickering candle, noting the odd phosphorescent sheen that reminded him of glow worms in a Tolkien forest. Mother Agnes, tapping her cane against the stone floor, muttered an old chant that seemed to scrape the very walls, and a hidden parchment fluttered from the corner shelf. The parchment detailed a pagan rite called the blood of the newborn, performed centuries ago to appease a forest spirit that demanded both fungus and infant blood for protection. The revelation hit like a medieval mic drop. The town's trusted remedy was a resurrected occult recipe, not a saintly blessing. A grin cracked across Agnes's face. She loved a good plot twist, even if it involved baby blood. The town council, draped in woolen robes and clutching rosary beads, shouted that the brew was holy, citing Saint Bartholomew's own miracle of cleaning out the pestilence. Thomas, however, raised an eyebrow and whispered, "It's basically a medieval version of a Red Bull with toad flavoring." Mother Agnes, amused, replied, "If the devil's in the details, then I'm the devil's best friend." The debate erupted like a tavern brawl, with one alderman invoking the Force as if a Jedi could heal fevers, while another swore by the sacred power of duct tape to stop the leak of newborn blood. Irony dripped from the ceiling like rain, and the crowd's roar sounded like a medieval remix of a rock concert. As the fever spikes rose, the two healers stood at the crossroads of old belief and new curiosity, the brew simmering like a ticking time bomb in a cauldron. Mother Agnes lifted her spoon, declaring she'd add a pinch of sage to cleanse the pagan taint, while Thomas plotted to test the potion on a wounded pigeon first. Because science, he muttered, is just magic with paperwork. The townsfolk watched, half trembling, half laughing, as the ancient rite and the modern mind collided in the humming infirmary. Whether Saint Bartholomew's name would be etched in relief or scandal, only the next cough would tell. In the end, the healing hall became a stage where history, humor, and a splash of newborn blood performed a bizarre ballet of hope. Thomas trudged up the rugged alpine path, his boots sloshing through a chorus of meltwater and pine sap. The wind howled like an angry banshee, rattling the bells of the distant abbey of St. Hildrun. He arrived at a stone gate crowned with ivy, where a monk with eyes as sharp as a hawk's beak greeted him with a smile that tasted of mildew. The air inside the cloister smelled of wet stone, incense ash, and something sweetly unsettling, like honey gone rogue. Thomas swallowed his awe and followed the monk into a candle-lit infirmary where leeches dangled from the ceiling like grotesque chandeliers. The head monk, Brother Alaric, lifted a cracked ceramic vial and declared, "Behold the leech-laced elixir, brewed from the mountain's very blood and the monk's own honeyed patience." He poured a viscous amber liquid into a wooden cup, the scent of burnt incense ash mingling with the sour tang of leech slime. A perfume that could make a dragon retch. With a theatrical flourish, he added a pinch of ash, watching it swirl like a mini volcano in the broth. The monks chanted a low dirge, their voices vibrating against the cold stone as the elixir simmered, bubbling like a cauldron of gossip. Thomas, half horrified and half fascinated, noted that the drink looked like something a medieval influencer might post on a scroll story for shock value. According to the monks, the recipe was a gift from a wandering hermit who once healed a dragon nursing a broken wing. The hermit, wrapped in a cloak of midnight moss, had supposedly whispered the ingredients into Alaric's ear after the beast breathed a plume of fire that forged a new mountain spring. Legend says the dragon, in gratitude, offered its shed leeches, considered the most potent blood-suckers in the realm. The tale sounded as epic as a Game of Thrones reunion, complete with fire-breathing beast and mysterious mentor. Yet the monks recited it with reverent solemnity, as if quoting the ultimate culinary cheat code. Thomas could almost see the hermit's ragged beard, flickering like a candle flame, vanishing into the mist. The first sip sent a shiver down Thomas's spine as the leech-laden brew slipped down his throat, tasting like a mixture of honey, iron, and regret. Within minutes, his limbs grew heavy, the muscles tightening into a numbness that felt like winter's grip on a wooden door. His eyes fluttered shut, and vivid visions erupted, swirling mosaics of the hermit dancing atop the dragon's tail, ancient runes glowing like neon signs in a medieval rave. The monks watched, eyes wide, some whispering prayers, while others stifled giggles at the ridiculousness of it all. The side effects, a cocktail of paralysis and hallucinatory cinema, made the whole affair feel like a medieval version of a reality TV detox challenge. When the visions faded and Thomas's limbs loosened, the monks gathered in a circle, their faces a mix of awe, dread, and the reluctant realization that faith alone could not cure everything. Brother Alaric slammed his fist on the stone table, sending a cloud of ash puffing like a dragon's sneeze, and declared, "We must question the source of our miracles, lest we become leech-drunk fools." The irony was thick. They had placed blind faith in a recipe from a hermit who healed a dragon, only to be humbled by a potion that could render you immobile and see the world through a psychedelic lens. They vowed to temper their fervor with skepticism, promising to test each remedy like a medieval lab rat. Thomas left the abbey with a grin, the taste of leech still on his tongue, and a story worthy of tavern gossip for generations to come. When the black veil of the plague slipped over Lichfield, the cobblestones seemed to weep with a sour, iron smell. Children clutched ragged scarves, while merchants shuttered their stalls, their faces hidden behind soot-black masks. Even the church bells, usually ringing like gossiping birds, told mournfully, each clang reverberating through empty alleyways. In the cramped hush of St. Mary's Infirmary, the fevered coughs rose like a choir of dying drums, and there, amid the gloom, Mother Agnes, the town's wiry herbalist, whispered of a remedy older than the cathedral stones. She spoke of a crimson candle, waxed from the pulverized shells of scarab like beetles that had once scuttled through royal feasts. Those shells, ground to a glittering red dust, were mixed with the freshly gathered tears of a condemned thief, a man whose last breath tasted like rust and regret. The mixture was poured into a wick spun from the hair of a blacksmith's mare, giving the flame a sickly glow that reminded onlookers of a dying star. Legend claimed the candle could choke the pestilence, its smoke a fragrant armor against the unseen killer. The townsfolk frowned, half amused and half horrified, as Agnes lit the candle, and the room filled with a perfume that smelled like wet tombstone and cinnamon. As the crimson flame flickered, its smoke curled upward, wrapping each listener in a veil of violet-tinged haze. Soon, visions erupted. Thomas saw himself stealing loaves. Mother Agnes recalled a childhood of blood-wide fields, and old Mrs. Dobbins relived the day she accidentally burned her husband's eyebrows. The hallucinations were as vivid as a medieval VR headset, except the graphics were made of guilt, shame, and the occasional dancing skeleton. Some swore they heard the thief's whispered confession echoing in the candle's glow, a promise that his tears would seal the plague's fate. The air grew thick, sweet, and sour, like a medieval tavern after a bad ale batch, and the townspeople clutched at their throats, coughing out specters of their sins. Restlessness spread faster than the disease itself. A murmur rose, half prayer, half protest, as people paced the infirmary's stone floor. Thomas, whose hands still trembled from the last bout of fever, felt the weight of the candle like a gauntlet thrown by destiny. He glanced at the condemned thief's empty shackles, recalling the executioner's grin, a grin that seemed to say, "I'm just a side quest character in this grim RPG." Should he trust a remedy that smelled of beetle carapace and a murderer's sorrow, or cling to the bitter certainty of leeches and bloodletting? The decision hung in the stale air, as palpable as the candle's smoke, waiting for a single spark of courage. In the end, Thomas blew out the crimson candle, letting its ember fall like a dying star onto the cold stone. And for a heartbeat, the room fell into a hushed silence, louder than any church bell. The plague did not vanish in a flash of holy light. Instead, it lingered, a stubborn nuisance, like an over-enthusiastic pop-up ad. Yet the townsfolk, oddly soothed by the shared hallucinations, found a strange camaraderie, swapping stories of their sins as if swapping trading cards. Mother Agnes, chuckling with a cough that sounded like a squeaky toy, declared the candle a success, because at least it turned fear into, well, slightly more entertaining dread. And somewhere beyond the town walls, a minstrel would later sing of the crimson candle of the plague doctor, a tale as bittersweet as beetle shells and thief's tears, reminding future generations that sometimes the strangest cures come wrapped in irony. The night draped the village of Brackenford in a scarlet shawl, the moon swollen like an angry beetle's shell. Under its blood-red glare, the mayor's daughter lay trembling, fevered, her breaths shallow as a dying candle. Thomas, the apothecary with more scars than a battle-worn knight, paced the dim cellar while Agnes, his soot-smudged apprentice, whispered prayers that sounded half hymn, half hiss. The townsfolk gathered at the window, clutching pitchforks and cheap ale, hoping a miracle would rise from the gloom. Tonight, they would test a remedy whispered to have been forged by a Viking shaman who once bargained with wolves for a better beard. In a rust-stained cauldron, they crushed bat wings until the flesh turned to a powder that smelled of damp caves and old curses. They added a vial of wolf bile, its acrid sting like burnt pine, collected from the pack that guarded the forest's edge. The final ingredient, the still warm heart of a newborn lamb, thumped once in the mixture before being diced, a squeaky chorus of innocence and sacrifice. Agnes swore the ingredients twitched with the same vigor as the Viking shaman's legend, a tale that grew taller than a Norse saga after every tavern toast. The concoction bubbled, flashing pink, as if the moon itself had decided to throw a rave in a potion. Thomas slathered the thick, tar like poultice onto the girl's trembling chest, the mixture searing her skin like a branding iron on a fresh hide. The heat rose, and the air filled with a scent of iron, rotting feathers, and the faintest hint of cumin. A perfume no medieval perfumer would dare bottle. As the moon climbed higher, its crimson light seemed to pulse, turning the village square into a stage for a grotesque ballet. Agnes sang a low chant, her voice cracking like a lyre on a drunk sailor's deck, while the poultice hissed, releasing tiny sparks that danced like fireflies on a battlefield. The townspeople gasped, half in awe, half in the realization that that the remedy felt more like a curse being cooked. Word spread faster than a rumor about a royal scandal, and soon every pair of eyes in Brackenford were glued to the trembling figure beneath the moon. Old Mabel, the baker, muttered that the scene reminded her of a Game of Thrones episode where dragons breathed fire on a sick child. Only this time the dragon was a bat wing paste. The mayor, red face and sweaty, paced like a nervous cat, clutching his hat as if it might shield him from whatever fate the poultice would deliver. Children peered from behind shutters, half expecting the girl to transform into a vampire and swoop down for their midnight snacks. Yet amid the chaos, Thomas kept his eyes on the girl's chest, watching the skin blister and then, miraculously, begin to smooth, as if the fire were being rewound. At the climax, the blood moon reached its apex, and a hush fell, broken only by the soft crackle of the poultice finally cooling. The girl's fever broke with a sigh that sounded like a dying drum, and a faint smile tugged at her lips, brighter than any lantern in the square. The townsfolk erupted into cheers, half relieved, half convinced they had just witnessed a medieval miracle mixed with a dash of Viking witchcraft. Thomas, wiping a splatter of bat wing residue from his cheek, joked that he'd never trust a remedy that smells like a dragon's armpit again, though Agnes rolled her eyes and said the real magic was the teamwork. As the moon waned, Brackenford breathed easy, but the story of the blood moon poultice would linger in tavern tales for generations, a reminder that sometimes the strangest cures can save a town, or at least give it a good story to brag about. The sunrise painted the market square gold as the blacksmith's daughter threw herself upright on the straw mattress, eyes sparkling like fresh parchment. Around her, the townsfolk erupted in raucous cheers, juggling mugs of sour ale and clanking copper pans in a celebration that smelled of burnt cheese and fresh pine. Word had traveled fast that the strange cure, an unholy mix of honey, ground beetle shells, and a whispered incantation, had revived her from a fever that threatened to claim her life. Children danced barefoot on the damp stone, their laughter ricocheting off the timbered walls like a medieval tick-tock. Even the mayor, normally as dour as a rain-soaked cloak, cracked a grin so bright it seemed to chase away the lingering dread. Amid the revelry, Thomas, the town scribe, slipped a leather-bound journal into his satchel, noting each gasp and grin with a scholar's precision. He inked down the dosage, a spoonful of nettle infusion boiled with crushed rosemary, while observing that the girl's quick recovery seemed to hinge more on the crowd's fervor than the potion's chemistry. His margins were filled with doodles of beetles and a witty remark about the power of believing you've been handed a superhero serum. He also recorded the faint, bitter aftertaste that lingered on the villagers' tongues, a taste that reminded him of swamp water mixed with wilted lettuce. By the candlelight, Thomas whispered that perhaps the cure worked because the mind, like a stubborn horse, will run faster when spurred by hope. When Thomas later presented his cramped manuscript to the Guild of Healers, the pages sparked a quiet mutiny against blind superstition. He laid out the outcomes in neat columns, contrasting the ecstatic cheers with the subtle, measurable drop in fever spikes, letting evidence speak louder than enchanted chants. The healers, initially skeptical as a cat beside a barrel of boiling oil, began to trade stories of other odd remedies, noting common herbs that actually soothed inflammation. Thomas's notes preserved the bizarre folklore, like the legend of a rooster's feather that cured hiccups, while planting the seedlings of rational inquiry, as if he were planting mustard seeds next to a dragon's hoard. The town's tavern walls soon echoed with jokes about Dr. Thomas, the medieval Sherlock Holmes of potions, hinting at a cultural shift that felt both absurd and promising. The air in the infirmary grew thick with the pungent perfume of crushed sage, and the metallic tang of blood dried on rough wooden tables. Visitors could hear the occasional clink of glass jars, each harboring murky tinctures that sloshed like reluctant secrets. Thomas could feel the sticky residue of the nettle brew on his fingertips, a sensation that reminded him of a prickly sweater after a winter feast. Yet beneath the grime, there was an undeniable clarity, a faint, sweet afterglow that lingered like a sunrise after a storm, coaxing even the most hardened skeptic to inhale deeper. The combination of sight, smell, and sound turned the whole episode into a sensorial tapestry, one that would be remembered long after the last cough had faded. Decades later, bards would still sing of the day the village rose from the ashes of fear, weaving Thomas's journal into verses that sounded like a medieval rap battle. Scholars in distant universities, sipping coffee like modern alchemists, would cite his observations as the first footstep toward evidence-based medicine, marveling at how a simple notebook could topple centuries of myth. The strange cure, once hailed as magic, now sat in museum cabinets as a reminder that even the most grotesque remedy can contain a grain of truth. As the town's children grew up, they traded tales of beetle shells for stories of microscopes, proving that lore and reason can coexist like a knight and his squire. In the end, the legacy of that odd knight was not just the healed daughter, but a whispered promise that curiosity, when fed with a dash of humor, can outshine any superstition. The fog rolled over Eldermore like a damp blanket, muffling the clatter of potters' wheels and the occasional bleat of a stray goat. In the crooked timber of the village hall, a nervous murmur rose as the council summoned midwife Aelith. Her hands famed for coaxing life from the stubborn earth. Word had traveled faster than a raven on a caffeine binge. Mara's womb had been barren for 3 long winters, and the village felt the ache of empty cradles. Aelith stepped through the mist, her cloak smelling of smoked rosemary and river mud, ready to trade herbs for hope. The air tasted of damp stone and whispered promises, each breath a reminder that superstition hung heavier than the morning dew. Old wives spoke of rosemary like it were a secret love letter to the fertility gods, insisting that a sprig bound tight around a pregnant belly could summon a baby as surely as a bard summons applause. They swore the herb's needle-sharp scent could tickle the uterus, coaxing it into action like a well-timed punchline. Mothers-to-be would wrap the green stalks in linen, believing the fragrant ribbon would stir the invisible weavers of destiny. Aelith recalled a tale where a shepherd's wife gave birth after a stray rosemary leaf slipped into her stew, prompting the villagers to treat the herb like a talisman on a reality TV dating show, only more desperate. Yet the scent, sharp and piney, clung stubbornly to the villagers' throats, making even the toughest men cough like they'd inhaled a dragon's sneeze. Father Corwin, the village priest, thundered out his warning with the gravitas of a man who'd seen too many sheep drown in the holy well. He claimed any stray herb, be it lavender, nettle, or a rogue dandelion, would summon misfortune faster than a meme spreads on the internet. A single sprig of sage, he intoned, could turn a healthy birth into a tragedy worthy of a Shakespearean plot twist. The congregation shivered, fearing that even the scent of a nearby garden could summon the plague of infant mortality. Yet beneath his stern veneer, Corwin's eyes flickered with a secret amusement, as if he'd just watched a cat chase its own tail and found it oddly profound. Aelith chuckled softly, her laughter bubbling like a brook over smooth stones, and set to work with a satchel of herbs that smelled like a medieval spice market after a rainstorm. She selected only the finest rosemary, stripping it of any wayward weeds with the precision of a surgeon who's also a stand-up comic. As she tied the herb around Mara's swollen belly, the rope creaked, echoing the groan of an old wooden ship, while the rosemary's needle-sharp fragrance danced in Mara's nostrils, making her gag and giggle in equal measure. The midwife whispered an ancient chant, half prayer, half punchline, hoping the gods would hear the humor in her plea. Meanwhile, the priest hovered at the doorway, clutching his rosary like a nervous gamer clutching a controller, ready to intervene should the rosemary misbehave. When the moon rose, silver and smug. The village held its breath as Mara's labor began with a roar that sounded suspiciously like a tavern brawl. The air filled with the iron-sharp scent of blood, the sweet tang of sweat, and the lingering piney perfume of rosemary, each scent vying for dominance like rival bands on a festival stage. Aelith coached Mara through each contraction, her voice steady, her humor sharp, reminding the onlookers that even in darkness, a well-placed joke can be a lantern. As the first wail of a newborn pierced the night, the villagers erupted in cheers, half reverent, half amazed that a humble herb had not summoned doom, but a squalling, wrinkled bundle of joy. Father Corwin, eyes wide as a newborn's, muttered a blessing, then muttered under his breath, "Maybe we should let the herbs have a Netflix subscription next time." Mara swayed through the mud-splattered market lane, her belly bulging like a ripe barley sack, while the scent of roasting pheasant mingled with the sharp tang of horse sweat. A gaunt peddler with a patched cloak hawked a glittering silver rabbit's foot, tapping it against his wooden cart with a clang that sounded suspiciously like a medieval ringtone. He whispered, "Place this beneath your pillow, and the babe will sprout healthy as a spring hare," his eyes flickering like lantern fireflies. Mara's hands trembled as she caught the foot, feeling the cold metal bite against her palm, and the crowd around them hushed as if awaiting a royal proclamation. The whole scene could have been a medieval sitcom, if only the gods had a sense of humor. Aelith, Mara's stern sister, with a scar shaped like a crescent moon on her cheek, scoffed at the peddler's spiel while secretly clutching a bundle of dried lavender for calm. The village whispered that a missing rabbit's foot could summon a stillbirth, a belief older than the stone bridge that creaked every night like a tired sigh. Aelith's skepticism tangled with dread, for she could feel the weight of every woman's gaze, eyes glazed with fear, mouths muttering prayers that smelled of pine resin and fear. She paced the thatched cottage, the floorboards groaning under each step like a nervous stomach, and wondered if superstition was just another crop to harvest. Yet the desperation in Mara's voice made Aelith consider that perhaps this foot was the only thing standing between a healthy babe and a silent cradle. When night fell, Mara slipped the silver foot under her pillow, the metal clinking against the straw like a tiny bell, announcing a secret pact. The room filled with the sweet, yeasty scent of newly baked rye bread from the hearth, mingling with the musky perfume of the goat's milk she had been nursing. Aelith recited the ancient rite, her tongue catching on the old words that sounded like a medieval rap battle, each syllable echoing off the timber walls. Outside, crickets sang a chorus that could have been a medieval soundtrack, while the wind rattled the shutters as if the house itself were breathing. The whole ritual felt oddly like a modern-day spa day, if the spa offered guarantees about unborn children and charged in rabbit foot currency. By dawn, a scream cracked the quiet. The silver foot had vanished, leaving only a cold imprint on the pillowcase, like a ghost's fingerprint. The villagers swarmed the cottage, their faces twisted in horror and curiosity, whispering that the foot must have been stolen by a mischievous fae, or worse, that the stillbirth demon was already at the door. Aelith's heart hammered like a war drum as she searched every crevice, finding only a trail of tiny silver shavings that glittered like confetti at a royal feast. The smell of damp earth rose from the floorboards, reminding everyone of graves and the inevitable march of mortality. Ironically, the peddler stood in the doorway, a half smile playing on his lips, as if he'd just pulled a prank on a medieval version of a late-night talk show. Aelith seized the moment, demanding the peddler return the foot or face the village's wrath, her voice cutting through the morning fog like a sword through butter. The peddler, shaking his silver-tipped cane, confessed that he had slipped the foot into a hidden pocket to test the villagers' faith. A twisted social experiment worthy of a Netflix true crime docuseries. With a theatrical flourish, he produced the foot, now dented and smelling faintly of pine tar, and placed it back beneath the pillow, promising no more tricks unless anyone wanted a sequel. Mara, half laughing, half crying, clutched the foot to her chest, feeling the cold metal pulse like a tiny drumbeat of hope. The cottage settled into an uneasy peace, the scent of fresh bread rising again, as if the universe had hit the reset button on a medieval reality show. The fields of Thornyhaven lay, cracked like an old man's skin, the rye whispering for water that never came. A sudden drought had turned the village well into a dusty mouth that sputtered only stale air. The council elders, cloaked in moth-eaten wool, thumped their fists on the stone table and declared that the unborn child of midwife Aelith must be baptized at midnight under the full moon to appease the rain gods. Their voices rose and fell like a chorus of coughing crows, and the whole town could smell the hot, coppery scent of desperation in the night air. Even the village dog, a mangy mutt named Sir Barks-a-Lot, gave a mournful howl that sounded suspiciously like a lament from a medieval metal ballad. Aelith stood in the shadow of the chapel, her hands trembling, while she clutched a candle that flickered like a nervous firefly. She wrestled with the dangerous ritual, imagining the holy water turning into a slippery eel that might drown the baby before the priest could utter the blessing. The stone floor was cold, seeping the chill of 100 unpruned graves, and the scent of incense mixed with the sour tang of wet earth from a recent rain-kissed puddle. as the moon rose, its silver light sliced through the stained glass like a giant cheese slicer, casting grotesque, colorful shadows across the pews. Aelith muttered a prayer that sounded like a sarcastic tweet from a monk. May the sky finally remember to water us, or at least send a meme about rain. Word spread faster than a gossiping sparrow that a cracked mirror in the chapel foretold a cursed birth, and the townsfolk began to clutch their rosaries tighter than a miser clutching coins. The mirror, shattered into a spiderweb of silver shards, reflected the moon in a way that made every onlooker see a flickering visage of a baby with horns, a vision that could have been lifted straight from a Netflix horror series. Mothers whispered that the child would be born with a permanent diaper change, while fathers muttered that the infant would develop a taste for peas and gossip. The scent of mildew and old wax seeped from the altar, mingling with the acrid odor of fear that lingered like a bad after-dinner mint. Aelith, however, laughed nervously, noting that if the baby turned out to be a future dragon rider, at least the drought would finally have a dramatic plot twist. The whole village gathered in a semicircle, their faces lit by torchlight that sputtered like a faulty Wi-Fi connection. Old Gerhardt, whose beard could house a family of weasels, chortled that the rain gods were probably just on a coffee break, and that praying to them at midnight was as effective as sending a DM to a deity. Women in woolen shawls clucked their tongues, their knuckles white from gripping the hem of their dresses, while the blacksmith's apprentice tried to hammer a nail into the chapel door for good luck, only to hit his thumb and yelp like a cartoon character. The air grew thick with the aroma of boiled cabbage and damp earth, a scent that reminded everyone of their mother's kitchen and the inevitable mud pies of the coming flood. Yet, beneath the chuckles, a palpable tension crackled, as if the very sky were holding its breath, waiting to drop a meteor, or at least a drizzle of rain. When the clock struck 12, the priest lifted the holy water, which glimmered like a freshly minted coin, and poured it over the infant's forehead, while chanting in a voice that sounded like a karaoke rendition of Gregorian chant. The moon, now a full silver disk, bathed the chapel in a cold, oily glow that made the stone walls sweat tiny beads of condensation. Suddenly, a low rumble rolled across the hills, the sound of distant thunder that smelled of ozone and freshly baked bread, and a fine spray of rain began to patter on the thatched roof. The villagers erupted into a chorus of relieved howls, some shouting huzzah, while others whispered, "We finally got Wi-Fi from the heavens." As the rain washed over the cracked earth, Aelith cradled her baby, feeling the hot, salty sweat of hope on her brow, and swore that no future superstition would ever make her baptize a child under a full moon again. Unless, of course, the weather forecast called for a sequel. The moon hung low like a silver coin over the village as the baptism chants rose in trembling echo, and Mara's water broke with a pop that sounded oddly like a cork popping in a bottle of mead. Rain hammered the thatched roof, each drop a drumbeat that matched the thudding of her frantic heart. She clutched the wooden stool, the scent of wet straw and old incense spiraling into a pungent cloud around her. The midwife, Aelith, shouted prayers that sounded more like a rock concert chant than a solemn hymn. Outside, thunder growled, as if some celestial beast were growling at the newborn's imminent arrival. A cracked mirror leaned against the wall, its silvered surface splintered by a careless footstep earlier that evening. And out of the jagged shards slithered a shadowed figure that looked like a demon made of soot and spite. Its eyes glowed with a faint amber, like the last ember of a dying hearth, and it hovered over the birthing chamber, humming a tune that eerily resembled the theme from a 1990s horror video game. The air grew colder, frosting the stone floor and making Aelith's breath plume like a dragon's sigh. The villagers whispered that broken mirrors summoned evil spirits that stole newborn souls, a belief as old as the village well. Yet the demon's posture was comically lazy, as if it had mistook the room for a Monday morning meeting. Aelith, shaking off the chill, remembered the old superstition that a silver crucifix placed upon a child's chest could fend off such fiends, a practice that sounded like medieval version of a superhero shield. She fished a tarnished silver cross from her satchel, its surface etched with clunky Latin that read, "No evil here," and slapped it onto Mara's trembling belly with the vigor of a blacksmith forging a sword. The demon sneered, wagging a phantom tail, and muttered something that might have been a curse or a complaint about the price of rent. Aelith cracked a wry grin, muttering, "If this works, I'm buying a mirror-free house," while the rain drummed a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a rap beat. The crucifix gleamed, catching stray flashes of lightning like a tiny disco ball in the gloom. The labor's climax surged like a wave crashing against a cliff, and Mara's cries mixed with the storm's roar, creating a cacophony that could wake the dead, or at least a few very annoyed villagers. The infant emerged with a gasp that sounded like a newborn dragonlet, and its first wail sliced through the darkness, startling the demon into a twitchy retreat. The silver crucifix vibrated, humming a low note as if acknowledging its job well done, while the broken mirror behind it cracked further, scattering shards that glittered like confetti. Aelith caught the baby, wrapped in a swaddling cloth that smelled of wool and fresh rain, and whispered a promise that the little one would never know the fear of shadowed superstitions. The demon now reduced to a puff of smoky disappointment, faded with a sigh that reminded everyone that sometimes the scariest monsters are just bad lighting. When the storm finally passed, the sky cleared to reveal a pale sunrise that painted the thatch roofs in gold, and the village folk emerged, blinking as if they'd just woken from a medieval Netflix binge. They gathered around the newborn, cooing and muttering prayers, while secretly wondering if the silver crucifix was just a fancy garnish for a good story. Aelith laughed, noting that the demon's retreat was more theatrical than terrifying, like a poorly timed cameo in a sitcom. The broken mirror was smashed beyond repair, ensuring no future reflections could summon another shade. And Mara, exhausted yet exhilarated, swore she'd never trust a superstition that required a shiny metal cross unless it doubled as a fashion statement. And so, the child's first cry became the village's anthem, a reminder that even in the darkest myths, light and a dash of irony can always find a way through. The night air hummed with the relieved sighs of Eldermore as the newborn's cry stitched itself into the village's tapestry. Lanterns flickered like fireflies over the thatched roofs, while the scent of smoked mutton mingled with the earthy musk of damp thatch. Mara, still trembling from the ordeal, lay on a straw pallet, her belly cradling the tiny future of the hamlet. Elder Rowan raised his gnarled staff, eyes crinkling, and declared that the final rite must now be performed, lest the gods think they're being punked. A murmur of agreement rose as the villagers gathered their modest treasures: a bowl, some wheat, and an absurdly large bucket of rainwater collected from the last storm. In the center of the clearing, they poured the water into the bowl, the splash sounding like 1,000 tiny cymbals crashing on stone. One by one, they dropped golden wheat seeds, each puffed grain patting the surface with a soft thud that reminded old Tomas of popcorn popping in his mother's hearth. With solemn faces, but secretly smiling, the folk leaned over Mara's healed womb and sprinkled the murky mixture, letting the droplets kiss her skin like mischievous sprites. The superstition promised that the very act would fertilize the woman's future, as if the seeds could whisper secret growth spells into her blood. The crowd chuckled at the absurdity. If this works, I'll start a wheat-scented perfume line. Yet their eyes glittered with genuine hope. Soon after, the clouds that had lingered like an indecisive audience finally burst, drenching the fields with rain that smelled of iron and fresh moss. The soil, now slick and dark, seemed to gulp the water and swell with a hungry sigh, coaxing sprouts to push through like tiny green rockets. By sunrise, golden blades swayed in a breeze that sang a low, buttery hum, and the air was heavy with the the sweet perfume of ripening wheat. Children chased each other among the rows, laughing as they tripped over the soft, soggy ground, while the elders whispered that the rite had indeed coaxed the gods into a generous mood. The harvest that season swelled beyond any memory, the granaries bursting like overstuffed barrels at a tavern feast. Eldermore, once a place where superstition and survival waged a quiet war, now stood united under the banner of renewed fertility. The villagers built a modest shrine beside the well, plastering it with sprigs of wheat and a stone tablet that read, "When the seed meets water, the future blooms, no warranty required." They celebrated with a feast where roasted boar glistened with honey, the sound of lute strings weaving through the chatter like a mischievous wind. Stories of Mara's healing spread beyond the hills, echoing in taverns as far as the king's court, where a skeptical noble quipped that the whole thing sounded like a medieval version of the Sims cheat code. Yet the truth was simpler: belief, community, and a splash of water had turned fear into festivity, stitching a new chapter into the village's lore. As the last embers died down and the villagers drifted home, the night sky glittered with stars that seemed to wink knowingly at the scene below. Mara, now cradling her infant, whispered a thanks that tasted of milk and fresh rain, while a nearby goat bleated in protest, perhaps jealous of the attention. The irony that a handful of wheat could coax such abundance was not lost on anyone. It was as if the gods had handed down a cheat sheet for life's hardest level, and somewhere a wandering minstrel began to hum a new ballad, promising that even in the murkiest of medieval times, a little faith and a splash of water could make miracles feel as common as a bad joke at a royal banquet. The tale closed not with a somber sigh, but with a hearty laugh that echoed through the fields, sealing Eldermore's destiny for generations to come.